To see you today, and thanks as always for checking in all the ways that you are. Everyone watching online, it's good to have you join us. All the mods that are part of our Correction Center campus, thanks for joining us. We are so glad that you are part of our church family. And then to everyone gathered at Elkhorn, at Millard, thanks for being here today. My name is Tim, one of the pastors here at Brookside, if we haven't had a chance to meet. And I love this Asking for a Friend series that we're in, where we are just letting some of the very real questions that sometimes bubble to the surface in our conversations at the student union on campus, in the break room, or the lunchroom at work. We're addressing some of these questions that bubble to the surface there. I mean, you may be asking some of these questions yourself where you identify personally as a skeptic, like just somebody who's more skeptical by nature. I get that. I kind of lean more that way myself. Or you're a seeker, somebody who's actively searching and just exploring, who is Jesus? What might he mean for my life? I hope that you see us engaging these questions in a way that is so friendly and welcoming, while at the same time being helpful and substantial. You see, as we read the Gospels, we see that Jesus was so open to honest and seeking questions. He loved interacting about these things, and so we just want to follow his lead as a church. Or maybe you're listening and you're a follower of Jesus. I hope this series is helpful for you in helping lay and reinforce foundations of our faith, just to equip you to have conversations about these things that matter deeply, and the conversations that all of us end up having in some way or another. And the permission to ask questions, just to follow truth where it leads, is a big part of my own story personally. I personally just love to learn, love to dig into things. I like to study, like to read. And so I'm glad when I was asking some really big questions, especially as a high schooler, I was never discouraged from asking those questions or from following the truth where it leads. And so we just want to keep in line with that in this series. And today the question we're asking is this: is Christianity anti-science? Or maybe you've heard it more like this: is Christianity, is it threatened by science? Do certain discoveries in the scientific world, do they eventually just make Christianity increasingly outdated and irrelevant? However you ask it specifically, these questions are all basically getting at the same thing. They're asking if the relationship between science and faith is inherently hostile, if we're talking about oil and water when we bring these two things up. And this is a big deal because back in 2011, not that long ago, the Barna Research Group ran a project that was driven by this question: why do people who grew up in church disconnect in their teen years, never to return, or for there to be some long period of absence from church life? And so they presented this research in an article called 6 Reasons Young Christians Leave Church. And one of these 6 reasons that Barna identified through all their polling and surveys and the stuff they do, one of these 6 reasons has everything to do with what we're talking about today. Here's how they phrased it. One of the reasons young people leave the church is because churches come across as antagonistic to science. Here are some quotes straight from the study itself. It says 1/4 of those surveyed for the project embrace the perception that Christianity is anti-science. 25% of a study base is a big number. Or listen to this: the research shows that many science-minded young Christians are struggling to find ways of staying faithful to their beliefs and to their professional calling in science-related industries. Now, certainly, and I would also add, unfortunately, that there can be simplistic, anti-intellectual pockets of Christianity that help stir this perception that Christianity is anti-science. There's a hostile relationship there, but voices in the scientific community aren't always helping this either. Physics Nobel Prize laureate Steven Weinberg, he said this. He said, the world needs to wake up from the long nightmare of religion. Anything we scientists can do to weaken the hold of religion should be done and may in fact be our greatest contribution to civilization. And so the point I'm trying to make here is that these things just stir the perception that the relationship between faith and science, between science and Christianity, is oil and water. It is antagonistic and it's an incompatible relationship. But the question I just want to throw out there and then to talk about today, to put in front of us is what if there's another way forward than seeing these two things as oil and water? Well, what if science and faith aren't contradictory or competing with each other? What if they're actually able to cooperate and complementary to each other? When Carrie's and my 4 boys were younger, a few of them played soccer, and we saw them play long enough that they went kind of from the soccer blob mentality, right, where every kid on the field is going after the same ball, right? Everybody's competing against everyone. There's some zero-sum game to try to get to the ball. They went from that soccer blob mentality to a team mentality, where they were passing the ball around, they were setting up plays, they were moving the ball further down the field toward the goal. They were playing the way the game was designed to be played. And that's the picture I want to give us. Not of soccer blob, right, where science and Christianity are both attacking the ball, trying to go at it, but team mentality. How do we see science and Christianity as complementary, as cooperating in certain ways? And so is Christianity anti-science? The short answer is no way. It's not. But we're not done yet, right? Don't start packing your things up, right? Because this is big enough, this is important enough. We need to dig into why this is the case. How can I say that Christianity and science are not contradictory or incompatible? By the time we're done, you will see that Christianity should actually encourage science, and that science can point us toward the Creator, toward God Himself. Stay with me, and you'll leave here with an instilled confidence in what Christianity offers, and you'll leave here with a fresh perspective on this relationship between Christianity and faith, or between Christianity and science, what it can look like. And so here are 3 things to keep in mind before we really start digging into this. Today is going to feel academic, so put your thinking caps on, but this is good, this is okay. You see, Christianity, true story, it is deeply concerned with our hearts. And, true story, Christianity is deeply concerned with our heads, with what we think, with truth, with careful thought. It's good for us to think deeply and closely about these things. We can do this, and every one of us should fight, should value for being an educated Christian. Second thing to keep in mind as we move ahead is I'm not a scientist, right? So just keep that in mind. So we're going to keep this fairly high level. But trust me, I said I like to read. I've probably gone some significant way towards like an undergraduate minor in philosophy of science. I've tried to take this seriously. So if you're listening in today as a scientist or in that space, that this is substantial and helpful for you. And then third thing to keep in mind as we move ahead is just follow the truth where it leads. If we get into waters that feel a little deep and you can't touch bottom, you're like treading water, like trying to keep your head above water, just come back to this. Follow the truth where it leads. I'm so glad I was encouraged that direction. I was never discouraged from asking questions. And bottom line is Christianity values truth deeply. Truth with a lowercase t and truth with a capital T. We believe Jesus is the embodiment of truth. And so let's value truth where it leads and see where it takes us. All right, so point number 1, now let's dive in. Christians should be first in line to encourage science. And the way that I understand the science, the way we'll talk about it here, is this is simply exploring and understanding, discovering more about the world around us. James Clerk Maxwell, he was a Scottish mathematician and scientist who lived in the 19th century, and you can learn a lot about him even just by scanning Wikipedia. Get this, he helped usher in the era of modern physics, laying the foundation for fields like special relativity and quantum mechanics. Many physicists today regard Maxwell as the 19th century scientist, physicist, having the greatest influence on 20th century physics. His contributions are considered by many in the science field to be of the same magnitude as those of Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein, right? So he's right there in that small cohort of big influential names. And something called the Millennium Poll, this survey of the 100 most prominent physicists. So there's a ranking for everything these days. The top 3 physicists that people say in this Millennium Poll: Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, and James Maxwell is number 3 on that. And so when Albert Einstein, when he visited the University of Cambridge in 1922, he was being shown around by his host. And his host said that Einstein had done great things because he stood on the shoulders of Isaac Newton. But Einstein corrected him and he said, "No, I stand on the shoulders of James Clerk Maxwell." And so all that to say, this guy Maxwell that maybe you've heard of, maybe you haven't, he's a big name in science, tremendously influential. And do you know what was carved above the door of the Cavendish Library, the laboratory that he founded at the University of Cambridge? Every time he walked into his laboratory, he saw a Bible verse. He had carved above his door Psalm chapter 111, verse 2. Here's what it said in the King James Version. Here's what he would have walked into every time Maxwell entered his laboratory. It says, "The works of the Lord are great," in the King James Version, "sought out of all of them that have pleasure therein." Or more updated English, here's the NIV, another Bible translation, just to bring it contemporary to today. It says, "Great are the works of the Lord. They are pondered by all who delight in them." You see, Maxwell saw this as a directive, as motivation for doing science, for loving the world around him, finding pleasure in nature, wondering at it, and trying to discover how it works. In other words, it's actually Christian theology, this belief, this conviction that God created a world that is structured, ordered, that's consistent, that we could study. It's this Christian theology that motivated Maxwell's science. Here's another passage that points to how the Christian faith should drive us to science in Matthew 22. Jesus has just been asked what the greatest commandment in the law is. And here's how Jesus replies in verse 37. He says, "Greatest commandment, here you go. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul." And what? And with all your mind. Jesus commands you. He commands me. He commands us to love God with our minds. You see, Christianity never asks you to check your brains at the door or to abandon reason in making faith commitments. Now, there's all sorts of ways we can and should apply this command to love God with our minds. But since we're talking about science today, let's keep it confined to that. You see, one of those applications is pursue science. Let's use the minds God has given us to love the world He's put us in and understand more about who we are, how things work. We're invited to do that. We're commanded to do that. We're commanded to love God with our minds. And the great news is we have so many examples of Christians who do this. We can even look around in the recent history, see examples of this. John C. LENNOX. He's Emeritus Professor of Mathematics at the University of Oxford. He's Emeritus Fellow in Mathematics and Philosophy of Science at Green Templeton College. He's written a ton on this intersection of faith and science. And in a little introductory book that's so helpful, just called "Can Science Explain Everything?" LENNOX looks back over the last century, the 20th century, and he says, guess what? 60%, actually over 60% of Nobel Prize winners, top-tier scientists, over 60% identify as Christian when asked about their religious preference. That's a big deal. Or even more recently, in 2009, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, it did a poll and found that 51% of scientists, so just a slight majority, right, but still a majority, 51% of scientists believe in some sort of deity or higher power, and 33% believe in God. Now, I know this doesn't get specific on what sort of God or higher power or deity they believe in, but the simple point I'm trying to make is they believe in something more than just science. And so this perception that science and Christianity are oil and water, that the relationship is inherently hostile, it is simply overstated. These two things are not in opposition to each other. We have scientists, a lot of scientists, who are good at what they do and firmly believe in God. And this goes back not just in the last century, but centuries even before that. See how many of these names sound familiar to you? Galileo, he's the guy that helped us see that the earth revolves around the sun, rather than the thinking prior to that the sun revolved around the earth. Michael Faraday, best known for his work on electromagnetism. You maybe have heard of the Faraday effect or the Faraday cage. Those tie back to this guy, Michael Faraday. Lord Kelvin, his name is memorialized in the Kelvin unit of temperature. Blaise Pascal was a French philosopher, mathematician, and physicist. You maybe remember him from the Pascal's triangle in math class growing up. Or Francis Collins, he led the team that mapped out the human genome. And until recently, he was the director of the National Institute of Health. All of these people on the screen are top-tier scientists. They're good at what they do. We are still benefiting from everything they discovered about the world around us. And they are firm and committed followers of Jesus Christ. So since we're talking about science today, let's not miss all these examples of scientists who have paved the way for us. So let me talk to middle schoolers, high schoolers, college students for like 1 second who are interested in the science space. I am so glad you are moving in that direction. I'm so glad we have people who follow Jesus and can show us what it looks like to excel in their field. We want people who can show us what that looks like increasingly and continuingly on into the future. See, we need Christians who can champion being really good at what they do and who can firmly follow Jesus Christ in public spaces. We need this in politics, in education, in healthcare, in the entertainment industry, media, in the trades. We need it everywhere, including in the sciences. So if you're in that space, if you're in middle school, if you're taking a physics class right now, and if you're interested in that, keep loving Jesus and keep sharpening that interest. Let's lean into that and see these things as complementary, as fitting together, rather than fighting against each other. Don't think it's one or the other. So Christianity should be first in line to encourage science. Point number 2, science can, and I would even say science should, summon us to God. Now, I know we're in the middle of a church service. I know that I'm a pastor, so you think, okay, Tim, we get it. That's what you're supposed to say. You're the pastor. But before we move on and check off that box too quickly, let's stop and appreciate how many atheists are saying exactly the opposite, that science doesn't point us to God. Steven Pinker is an atheist. He says, the findings of science imply that the belief systems of all the world's traditional religions and cultures are factually mistaken. So for him, science certainly doesn't point us towards God. Or Richard Dawkins, he sees a universe that has precisely the properties that we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So at least there's 2 quotes of people who say, Tim, science does not point us to God. Science points us exactly the opposite direction. So how do we think about this? Let me build a case for what I'm saying, coming at it from 2 angles. How does science point us to God? I would say, first of all, that the findings of science point to God. One of my 2 older brothers is a molecular biologist. Went to school for a lot of years, has a PhD. He runs a lab at a university. He actually teaches scientists how to do science. And I'd say he got it from me, but since he's my older brother and since he's a scientist, he could probably pretty quickly refute my genetic argument there. So a little scientific humor for you there, Matt. But anyway, Matt gets the complexities of everything we're talking about today. And Matt deeply appreciates what science offers. And he's a Christian. He follows Jesus. He values science, and he approaches it with a humility that I'm so grateful for and admire. And I was talking with Matt earlier this week on the phone, and I just asked him, Matt, is there anything especially persuasive to you as a scientist, looking at it through the lens of what you do professionally, that points towards a capital D designer? That's persuasive or even convincing to you, pointing towards who we would say is God, this capital D designer. And so Matt talked about all sorts of things that I probably didn't appreciate nearly enough in our conversation. But then eventually we boiled it down to this. For Matt, this especially persuasive indicator that there's a capital D designer, that there's God, is this issue of origins. Where Matt said, how do we get something from nothing? Especially a something that is irreducibly complex, something that's filled with information like DNA at the smallest bits of how we study it. So the smaller we get in terms of how we can study stuff under microscopes and everything else, we don't learn stuff as kind of basic, and then it builds towards complexity. At the smallest units we can see, there's information, there's complexity. Matt says, how do you get something like that? Something that is irreducibly complex from nothing. And so after talking about this tremendous complexity in the smallest bits of what we can study, Matt just said there has to be something more. And so many other scientists point to other scientific findings that just reinforce these findings that point to God. A few of these especially persuasive indicators include the fine-tuning of the universe, irreducible complexity in the origin of the universe, what we were just talking about. Another indicator is the fundamental laws of nature. Why are things even ordered and structured like they are? Why can we trust math and physics? If you start digging into any one of these things, they point to a designer. But then when you start to pile these things on top of each other, the accumulated weight of all of these things that individually point towards design together point towards a capital D designer. And for so many, this is persuasive, and for me, I would even say convincing evidence that capital D designer is God. Allan Sandage, a protege of Edwin Hubble, so that's the guy that the telescope is named after. He was a protege of Hubble, and Sandage was one of the most important and influential astronomers of the 20th century. And here's what Sandage said in a Newsweek interview. He said, "It was my science that drove me to the conclusion that the world is much more complicated than can be explained by science." Or here's another quote that won't be on the screens. Another scientist who's a Christian, Stephen Meyer, he puts it even more strongly. He says, explaining these mysteries, this fine-tuning of the universe, the origins of the universe, irreducible complexity, explaining these mysteries, it requires an intelligence who can act within the universe to produce the code necessary for life, and it requires an intelligence who can also act on the universe as a whole, from the beginning, to establish its finely tuned structure. So a designer who can work in the universe and a designer who can work on the universe. And all of this just reinforces what this guy named David said thousands of years ago. In Psalm chapter 19, verse 1, David says this, "The heavens declare the glory of God. Creation points to a creator. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day, they pour forth speech, and night after night, they reveal knowledge. It's a great verse to memorize, showing how the findings of the world around us, the way our jaw drops when we look up at the night sky and see the Milky Way galaxy, see all the stars in the sky. The findings of science point to a creator. A second reason I believe science can summon us to God is this: not just the findings of science, but I'd also say the limits of science point us to God. What do I mean by the limits of science? So behind me, you'll see a picture of a cake here in just a second. And imagine if we had this cake in a laboratory. Put it under a microscope. There's a whole lot of things we could learn about this cake. Probably more than we want to know. We could learn about its fundamental particles, the ingredients that went into making it, something about how it was put together. We could learn the effect that it would have on me if I ate it, right? Which is, we don't want to know that sort of information. But there's a lot we could learn about this cake if we studied it scientifically. But there's also things we can't learn. We couldn't learn if we studied this cake scientifically. There's no way science can tell you why this cake was made, what its purpose is. Is this cake made for a celebration? To celebrate a wedding or a graduation party, some big life event we're all hoorah about? Or is this cake's purpose to commemorate a passing, a funeral, the departing of a friend at a retirement party? There's no way we can know that, right? Just by studying this cake scientifically. We need someone else to tell us the purpose of this cake. We can't know who made this cake by studying it scientifically. Was it me? Then don't eat it, Or was it my wife, Carrie, who's really good at the stuff she makes? Sure, we can know there's a designer. This cake probably didn't happen just randomly, where suddenly there's a windy day in Omaha, and that cake is sitting in my backyard. There's a designer, but we can't say a thing about what that designer is like. You see, for all that it adds, science can't do everything. Let me be sure and point out that many scientists themselves acknowledge this. Stephen Jay Gould was an agnostic evolutionary biologist, so not a follower of Jesus. Look at what he says. He says, we cannot use nature. The thing that science studies, we can't use nature for our moral instruction or for answering any question within the magisterium, the authority of religion. Or he says elsewhere, to say it for all my colleagues and for the umpteenth millionth time, science simply can't adjudicate the issue of God's possible superintendence of nature. We neither affirm nor deny it. And so when we start adding up all the things that the hard sciences can't explain, our list now includes purpose, the identity of the designer, and morality. Science can't do those things. And yet these are the very things we need and long for. And the Christian God provides each of these things for us. God offers purpose. He tells us why we were created. He shows us who He is, right? God doesn't create and then back away. The Bible tells us that a personal God, it just makes sense that He want to communicate with a personal creation. So God reveals who He is. We aren't left to guesswork what the designer is like. And He directs our morality, even providing motivation for it. Not to earn His favor, but because He loved us enough to send His Son and die for us. The limits of science point to God. All right, let's review where we've been. Let's come up for water. Let's come back to the less deep end of the pool. Christians should be first in line to encourage science. And science can and should summon us to God. Now, what do we do with all this? What does this mean for our lives today, this week, as we think about the next few months, as we plan a college major? What does this mean for us? One takeaway is this: love God with your mind. We've already talked about this, so we're going to spend just 1 second on it. But let's be known as championing good, clear, careful thinking. Let's stay curious and humble. Both those things are important as we talk about this value of loving God with all of our heart, sure, all of our soul, yes, and all of our mind. Remember what I said earlier, Christianity isn't afraid of truth. Let's follow the truth where it leads. Second takeaway, cultivate wonder. The world around us is amazing. Right? As we look up at the skies, I've traveled to Zambia a bunch of times. When we're there, we're far enough away from any city light. You look up, you see like the thread of the Milky Way galaxy. You see however many stars you can see. Your jaw drops in wonder at creation. Let's marvel at the macro level of what God has done around us. Let's marvel at the micro wonder, at the micro level of what God has done around us. As we put a slide under a microscope and see information and complexity at the smallest bits of what we can study, let's let our jaw drop in wonder at what God has created. Let's allow these things to invite us to lean in, to discover, to explore the world that God has created around us. But we don't want to stop at just wondering at creation. You see, eventually we need to move from wonder at the creation to worship of the Creator. Romans chapter 1, verse 20, the Apostle Paul says, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, his divine nature, they've been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, from creation, so that people are without excuse." But then if we were going to keep reading the next few verses of that passage, we would see how instead of letting that wonder at creation to lead us to worship, we instead take that creation and we warp it. We turn it in on ourselves and we worship created things. Or we can see the creation as an end in itself rather than something marvelous that can and should direct our gaze upward towards God. So let's not twist creation. Let's not misunderstand it. Let's not see it as an end in itself. Let's study it. Let's explore. Let's discover. Let's do science. And let's humbly let that direct us to fix our gaze upward, to move from wonder to worship. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, God, we thank you for the wonder of the creation around us. God, we have just dipped our toe into such deep waters today that remind us how amazing the world around us is. So God, we just acknowledge again your power as creator, the wonderful things you have made at the macro and the micro levels. But Father, in our hearts, in our heads, through truth, help us to move from wonder at the creation to worship of the Creator. To see ourselves as creatures who need a Creator who tell us how to live, what our purpose is, and God, what a good God you are. We need you for this. So work in our hearts, work in our minds, work in our midst in this way. We love you, Jesus. We pray these things in your name. Amen.